I'm going to be talking about the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, not only how it's an incomplete diagnosis, but it's also the most dangerous and harmful diagnosis in psychiatry today. But before I go there, we are all here in this beautiful city of Lisbon because the World Professional Association for Transgender Health is just moments down the road. So I thought it was only fitting to take a few minutes of my time to recap just how spectacularly awful 2024 is shaping up to be for WPATH. The first blow came in March when Michael Schellenberger and I released the WPATH files, which revealed to the world what most of us, all of us, already knew in the gender debate, that WPATH is a fringe group of activists masquerading as a professional medical association, advocating for a reckless experiment to be performed on children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults. WPATH responded to these accusations by saying, "The world is not flat. Gender, like genitalia, is represented by diversity." So at least we know they're not flat earthers. Then in April came the Cass report, which was the result of a 4-year-long investigation into England's Youth Gender Service. And part of that report was a systematic review of the guidelines in gender medicine that revealed WPATH, along with the Endocrine Society, manufactured a consensus on gender-affirming care. They produced shoddy guidelines based on the flimsiest of evidence that triggered a cascade of equally shoddy guidelines and policy statements from medical associations all over the world. So what you're looking at on the screen, this is a tangled web of circular citations, and at the center lies an empty shell, devoid of anything resembling real science. And then finally in June came the unsealed documents in a legal challenge to Alabama's ban on youth gender medicine that could not have been more damning for WPATH. Emails released as part of the discovery process revealed, among other things, that top WPATH members had interfered with supposedly independent systematic reviews, suppressing evidence that didn't suit their political goals. That Admiral Rachel Levine, a member of WPATH and Biden's Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, pressured WPATH to remove the minimum age requirements in its Standards of Care 8 because citing concerns that these recommendations would undermine the Biden administration's political agenda. And lastly, that some Standards of Care 8 authors, along with social justice lawyers, shunned evidence reviews because they knew the results would reveal little to no evidence, and this would in turn harm litigation efforts. But my favorite is the next one, not because it's damning, but just because it's really quite hilarious. When the American Medical Association refused to endorse WPATH Standards of Care 8, then President Walter Baumann was so enraged that he called the AMA members white, cisgender, heterosexual hillbillies from nowhere. So I think it's safe to say that WPATH's carefully crafted facade as a respectable professional medical association has been well and truly demolished. And the world now sees them for what they are. They're trans activists armed with syringes and scalpels who prioritize politics over the health and well-being of some of the most vulnerable people in society. And it's only going to get worse for them from here on in. Okay, but enough about that, because I want to get to the most destructive diagnosis in psychiatry today. Successful, effective medical treatment begins with an accurate and timely diagnosis. Without a clear picture of what is afflicting a patient, doctors cannot provide appropriate treatment, which is why misdiagnosis is one of the leading claims in medical negligence. So just imagine the catastrophic damage that would occur if an entire field of medicine were based on an incomplete, dangerous, and practically meaningless diagnosis. Of course, you don't need to use your imagination to picture the chaos that would ensue, because you just need to look around at the world. That's exactly what's happening. And it's the reason we're all here in this room today. In the American Psychiatric Association's great work of fiction, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, the diagnosis is gender dysphoria. In the World Health Organization's International Classification for Diseases, it's gender incongruence. These diagnoses manage to be exceptionally dangerous, yet almost completely devoid of meaning, both at the same time. I happen to have spent the last few months immersed in the DSM, and I have to say I don't recommend doing that. Because what happens when you spend too much time reading the DSM is you start to diagnose yourself and everyone around you with mental disorders. There's actually a term for this. It's called psychology student syndrome, inspired by the well-known medical student syndrome. So when medical students are studying all the various diseases, they start to believe they're experiencing the symptoms themselves. And psychology students do the same thing with mental health conditions. So in the last few months, I've put one of my children on the autism spectrum. I've diagnosed another with body dysmorphic disorder and another with ADHD. And while I was reading the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, with things like forgets to return calls, is easily distracted, often loses keys, I thought, oh my God, I have ADHD. That's why I can never find my keys. In truth, we have none of those disorders. We're simply human beings with our quirks, insecurities, odd habits, and occasional disorganization. But it's all too easy to apply DSM diagnoses to your life, to interpret your oddities, your strange behaviors, or your pain through the lens of a particular diagnosis. A diagnosis can also be very powerful, shaping the way you see yourself and the way you behave, and people can become deeply attached to a diagnosis, particularly if it provides a sense of relief or comes with the promise of a cure. And as I've already said, today there is no more dangerous diagnosis to apply to your life than gender dysphoria, or even worse, to apply to your child's life. Before I get to the absurdity of the adolescent and adult diagnostic criteria, let me say a few words about the diagnosis of childhood onset gender dysphoria. Gender nonconformity in childhood only became a psychiatric disorder because in the 1950s, men seeking the impossibility of a sex change began showing up in clinics recounting stories of childhood femininity, prompting researchers to study feminine boys. Many of the stories these men told were likely fabricated just as a way to get the hormones and surgeries that they so desperately desired. But by the time psychiatrists realized that, it was too late. Gender nonconformity in children had been pathologized, and psychiatry had opened the door to one of the most harmful concepts of all time, the transgender child. It cannot be said often enough or strongly enough that there is no such thing as a transgender child. If a little boy says he's a girl, the adults in his life need to tell him, kindly but firmly, that he is not, and he never can be. It is our duty as adults to keep children tethered to reality as they explore the world and find their place within it. Help gender nonconforming children build resilience. Don't label them with a psychiatric disorder. So moving on to the adolescent and adult diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. Now, as something of a connoisseur of the DSM, I can honestly tell you that every time I look at these 6 diagnostic criteria, I find myself flabbergasted. It's just pure ideological gibberish. We've got 1 marked incongruence between your experienced and expressed gender and your body, which is basically nothing more than stereotypes. 4 strong desires: to be rid of one's sex characteristics, to have the sex characteristics of another gender, to be of the other gender, to be treated as the other gender. Absolute nonsense. And I love how they tack on, or some alternative gender, different from one's designated gender. How very scientific. And then the last one, a strong conviction that one has the feelings and reactions typical of the other gender, which is obviously something no one could never, ever possibly understand. This mind-boggling list of subjective feelings is the result of decades of pressure by trans activists, such as those congregated in a hall like this not far away, who one day decided that believing yourself to be a member of the opposite sex and wanting healthy body parts chopped off was not a mental illness, not because of any new scientific discoveries or the results of rigorous research, but simply because they didn't like the label and it didn't suit their political goals. So instead of gender identity disorder, which it was in the DSM-4, that pathologized the cross-sex identity, so activists demanded the APA change it to gender dysphoria, and that shifted the focus of to the emotional distress caused by having a mismatched gender essence trapped in the wrong sexed body. This is pseudoscience, plain and simple. So because trans activists have stripped the diagnosis of all meaning, it's tempting to dismiss it as not being real. But it is real to the person who experiences it, despite not being real in, say, the way cancer or diabetes is real. The pain is real, and because gender dysphoria exists in the symptom pool of our time, meaning it's a legitimate way to interpret and express your pain and be taken seriously by doctors, it's necessary to proceed as if it's real. So I love Ian Hacking, so taking a leaf out of philosopher Ian Hacking's book, the important question is not to ask, is the diagnosis real, but is it beneficial? Does it help a sizable number of people who satisfy these criteria to treat them as if they have gender dysphoria? Currently, such treatment spans 3 distinct branches of medicine: psychiatry, endocrinology, and surgery. When someone walks in off the street declaring themselves to be transgender, to know themselves to be a member of the opposite sex, to know themselves to have the feelings and reactions of the opposite sex, is it always good, or perhaps always bad, to usher such an individual onto the medical transition conveyor belt? Will this make their lives better or worse in the long run? These are the important questions. Which brings me to the main point I wish to make today. No one benefits from receiving this diagnosis. And the reason no one benefits is precisely because it is an incomplete diagnosis and therefore cannot be helpful. And most importantly, absolutely no one should be embarking upon a drastic, irreversible medical pathway based on this diagnosis. A diagnosis of gender dysphoria is the beginning of the diagnostic process, not the end. The only way to help those who satisfy these diagnostic criteria is to ask the all-important question, what's behind the symptom? What's behind the strong desire to be rid of one's sex characteristics? What drives the strong desire to be of the other sex? What causes a person to wish for the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex? Now, in the transactivist world of WPATH and all the rest of them, in gender-affirming medicine, there is no need to ask those questions because the answer to all is that the person is transgender. And you can see that they even had this written into the diagnostic criteria. Look at criterion B. The reason people have a strong desire to be rid of their sex characteristics is because of a marked incongruence with their experienced and expressed gender. That's just a fancy way of saying the person is transgender. And because in WPATH's world, being transgender is a natural, healthy variation of human existence, there is no need to investigate further. In fact, it's transphobic to do so. Which brings me now to probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say today. And that is, in the medical world, there ought to be no such thing as a transgender person. Now, I can already hear the screeches of transactivists accusing me of denying the existence of transgender people. I am not. Well, not really. I accept that transgender is a political identity, but that identity has no place in medicine. Doctors need to be able to see their patients in order to treat them effectively, and the political label of transgender acts as a smokescreen, blurring their vision. So what do we see when we lift the rainbow veil and really look at the people who meet the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria? We see men with autogynephilia who are aroused at the fantasy of becoming women, who have a strong desire for the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex to embody the object of their own desire. We see a tiny number of extremely gender nonconforming homosexuals, many with internalized homophobia who have a strong desire to be treated as the opposite sex as a way to be invisible. And we see legions of young, confused people making sense of their pain and distress through the fashionable lens of gender. They are lost, they are lonely, and they are hurting, and they are desperately searching for a solution. These young people have astronomically high rates of autism and plenty of ADHD. Some display traits of borderline personality disorder with its classic characteristic of an unstable sense of self. Others are just discovering a homosexual orientation and they haven't quite accepted that yet. And then there's depression, anxiety, and so much trauma. These are unhappy people in search of happiness who are seduced by the impossible promises transgender ideology makes. Adopt a new name, new pronouns, take hormones and undergo surgeries, and you can be a whole new person. Receiving a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from an expert confirms their self-declared transgender identity. It gives it legitimacy. They don't understand that the diagnosis was written by transactivists who prioritize politics over patient health. They don't understand that the experts handing out the diagnosis are true believers in an ideology that has no grounding in reality. In a medical setting, everyone who satisfies the diagnostic criteria of gender dysphoria must be treated as an individual, someone with a complex past that has shaped their understanding of themselves as a transgender person. But none are transgender in a medical sense, because there's no such thing. All deserve an accurate, complete diagnosis to understand themselves and why they have come to the conclusion that drastic, life-destroying medical interventions are the solution. Dr. Alan Francis, who was chair of the DSM-4 task force, which happens to be my favorite DSM, he says psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, especially for teenagers, because it's very easy to make the wrong decision, the wrong diagnosis, and very difficult to correct that mistake. But I believe there's another reason to write the diagnosis in pencil, and that is because many expressions of human suffering that we now view as symptoms of mental disorders are transient. They're just a natural response to life's struggles. Psychiatric diagnoses should therefore be written in pencil because life is messy and sometimes it's difficult, especially in adolescence. But it typically gets better, and when it does, those mental health symptoms may disappear or recede into the background. But gender-affirming clinicians don't believe in writing the diagnosis in pencil. They advocate for it to be written in blood, for it to be carved into the bodies of young people whose brains haven't even finished maturing yet, without even attempting to help them work through their distress, not even giving them the chance to grow and mature, persevere, and overcome their struggles. So, I may just be a white, cisgender, heterosexual hillbilly from nowhere, but I know a medical scandal when I see one. It is a crime to sterilize young people who still have their whole lives ahead of them. For surgeons to amputate the healthy breasts of teenage girls or castrate young gay men who haven't even had a chance to accept their sexuality yet. But to do so on the basis of an empty diagnosis and because the young person has adopted a fashionable political identity is an act of evil that is beyond comprehension. Successful medical treatment begins with an accurate diagnosis. In the case of gender-affirming medicine, medical mistreatment begins with an incomplete, meaningless diagnosis. Psychiatry can and must do better. Thank you.